According to the American broadcast media, Iran has committed some crimes. It's guilty. And because it's dangerous, they say, it's terroristic, it's, well, you know it, you hear it. And I want to make a statement because I think that what they call the crime of Iran, American Iranian Friendship Committee sees it as Iran has taken the position in the world to say we want to chart our own course. We want our own sovereignty. We want our own system of government. And we would appreciate it if people would not interfere and other nations would not make those kind of judgments that because we chose something different, it means we're bad. And American Iranian Friendship Committee says, no, that's not accurate. Words like war, unemployment, civil rights, peace, justice, repression, dumb war, smart war. These are some of the things we hear from the American government, some of the words. It's a mixture. We hear all these things. And what's been so disheartening is that there's been almost a change at the top level, and the media, the corporate media, has agreed to carry it out, and that is we're going to change the real meaning of what words mean. I was reading something that Ray McGovern, one of our speakers, wrote a while back, and he said there was a meeting in Washington and they called it regime change, and he said, in our day we called it overthrow the government. So this change in the language is not helpful. So that's why I'm so happy that we have three excellent speakers, and I'm not going to spend more time. What I would like to do, I'm going to say a very, very brief bio on each speaker, and then, if I have it here. Yeah, that's Nima. Okay. Some of them I know you've heard, and there are some other speakers that you may not have heard. So our first speaker is Nima Shirazi. He's a writer and a musician, and he's a contributing commentator for Foreign Policy Journal and Palestine think tank. His analysis of United States policy and Middle East issues, particularly with reference to current events in Iran, in Israel, and Palestine, can be found in various online publications, such as, and you can Google these, Palestine Chronicle, The Rag Blog, Monthly Review, Cold Type, Information Clearinghouse, Dissident Voice, Countercurrents, Axis of Logic, Future Fast Forward, Op-Ed News, World Can't Wait, CASME. Wow, Nima, I didn't realize you were so prolific. That's fantastic. What Really Happened, and InfoWars, as well as, I won't forget this, and please do go to his blog. It's called Wide Asleep in America. That's all one word, .com. And Nima has also been interviewed on both radio and television. And he lives in Brooklyn with his wife, his books, and there's a new little Shirazi on the way. Hope you don't mind me saying that, Nima. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Ellie. First off, it's great to see everyone here. An excellent crowd has turned out for this very important event. It's a pleasure to be on the same panel as both Brian Becker and Ray McGovern. I want to thank, obviously, the American Iranian Friendship Committee, especially Ellie and Ardashir, for inviting me to speak. I guess might as well jump into really why we're here. We're here to try and tell the truth about Iran. What we hear and what we read on a daily basis doesn't change much if we're reading it, the mainstream media especially. And what we hear is that, as Ellie said, Iran is a threat, Iran is dangerous, Iran is essentially intransigent and a violator of all sorts of laws and rights. And the truth of the matter is that Iran is a threat, but it's a threat to US and Israeli dominance in the world. That's what it is a threat to. That's why it is so demonized. It is demonized for essentially pointing out the hypocrisy and the duplicity of Western governments, and especially also of Israel. Iran is demonized primarily because its people, its population, overthrew a US-backed dictator over 30 years ago, and has consistently, ever since, demonstrated to the rest of the world fearlessly that essentially the US empire has no clothes. And actually, 2 days from now, January 16th, will mark the 32nd anniversary of the Shah of Iran being forced into exile. What's interesting is that just today, I don't know if you guys have been following the news, but just today in Tunisia, the US-backed dictator was forced to flee the country and is now in exile. Now, for the past month in Tunisia, there have been protests and riots and essentially a revolution going on. We didn't hear about that here. It took about 4 weeks for anything to get into the mainstream press, pretty much starting a couple days ago and then primarily today, when the president of the past 23 years was forced to flee the country. Now, look at the difference between the media coverage of Tunisia and what we saw in June of 2009 after the Iranian election, of the re-election of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Now, why was the media so tuned in to Iran at that time, while this time around paid no attention to Tunisia? Well, Tunisia, as I said, was supported very heavily by the United States. It's an ally of the United States in the so-called war on terror, which is really a war of terror. And whereas in Iran, when there was unrest, as it were, following an election, a democratic election that re-elected a president by popular vote without an electoral college or anything like that. When there was unrest there and people going out on the street, as they have the right to do, it was all over the press here. Now, why is that? It's because the Iranian government is enemy number one of the US government, and anything that shows the Iranian government in a bad light is going to be pushed and promoted by the press here and by the government here to consistently demonstrate that Iran is a threat. Now, the title of tonight's program essentially is Iran a nuclear threat? Well, this offers a whole new element to the scariness of this horrible, horrible country. Because a nuclear threat obviously has the capacity to annihilate the world and to strong-arm the world into doing its bidding. Obviously, nuclear threats do not include the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, which all have nuclear weapons. Obviously, a nuclear threat is not Pakistan and is not India, neither of which are signatories to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And a nuclear threat is certainly, could never be, the government of Israel, which has something around 400 nuclear weapons and can't possibly stop itself from attacking its surrounding countries, oppressing the people within its own country, stealing land from the indigenous people of Palestine, and violating human rights on a daily basis through occupation and apartheid. But of course, they're not a threat. Iran is a threat, even though Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon. And even though Iran has consistently been shown, and this has been consistently attested to by the IAEA, which monitors nuclear programs around the world. It's been shown and stated by the 16 US intelligence agencies that compile the National Intelligence Estimate, the NIE. Iran has consistently been shown to not even have a nuclear weapons program. Not that they don't even have a bomb yet, but they don't even have a program by which to make a bomb. The government of Iran, the officials of Iran, have consistently stated that they have no intention of building a nuclear weapon because on numerous grounds, whether it's religious, whether it goes against their religious values, which you can laugh off and say that's ridiculous, but fine. If we keep hearing that Iran's leaders are so theocratic, then don't you think their religious beliefs probably are important to them, and therefore if nuclear weapons go against their own religious beliefs, that may mean something? But even so, even not, let's say on a strategic military basis, Iranian government has consistently denied that there's any point to even having nuclear weapons because nuclear weapons didn't help the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan. Nuclear weapons haven't helped Israel having Israel be at peace with its neighbors. Nuclear weapons didn't prevent the collapse of the Soviet Union. Iran has consistently stated this. Iran has also denied that they would ever build nuclear weapons on purely humanitarian grounds. During the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi army, backed by the United States, attacked Iranian troops and Iranian civilians with biological and chemical weapons, including anthrax and mustard gas and lethal nerve gas. Over 60,000 Iranians were killed through these attacks. Iran never responded in kind, never used biological or chemical weapons on Iraqis, soldiers or civilians. And they were actually, incidentally, well within their rights to, whether that would have been a nice thing to do or not, but at the time, the only treaties and issues involved with biological and chemical weapons said that it was illegal to use them as a first strike, but not that you couldn't respond in kind. Nevertheless, Iran refused to respond in kind. So already we see a precedent for a country that states it doesn't want anything, has been shown by other agencies, outside agencies, that they don't have these things, that they don't want these things, that they don't have a program to build these things. And yet all we hear over and over and over again is that Iran is a nuclear threat, is that Iran is just around the corner from having a nuclear weapon. And we've been hearing this for the past 30 years. In 1984, a news article entitled "Ayatollah Bomb in Production in Iran." It's 1984. And this report warned everyone that Iran was moving very quickly toward a nuclear weapon and predicted that Iran would have one by 1986. Didn't happen. In 1992, Benjamin Netanyahu predicted that Iran was merely 3 to 5 years away from getting a nuclear weapon. The same year, a report out of Europe from a European news outlet reported that Iran already had 2 nukes. Already had. The same year, the CIA stated that by the year 2000, Iran would definitely have a nuclear weapon. Later, they changed that to 2003. In 1995, Netanyahu was back saying, yep, 3 to 5 years, they're going to have a nuke. The next year, Ehud Barak said that definitely by 2004, Iran would have a nuclear weapon. That same year, Shimon Peres, who was the prime minister at the time, said that by the year 2000, Iran's definitely going to have a nuclear weapon, and then later revised that to be 2005. Come 2005, the head of Mossad, Meir Dagan, stated that Iran was merely 3 years away from having a nuclear weapon. 2009, in front of a Capitol Hill committee at a hearing, the CIA director-to-be, Leon Panetta, said, "From all the info I've seen, I think there's no question Iran is seeking nuclear weapons capability." Now this comes not even 2 years after the NIE in 2007 stated that Iran doesn't even have a nuclear weapons program. And then the CIA director, basically, is still using this propaganda, saying that they're definitely seeking this capability, even though his own agency stated that they weren't. Just last week, upon his retirement, Meir Dagan, the Mossad head, stated that the nuclear threat of Iran has been staved off for now through the assassinations of nuclear scientists in Iran, through sanctions, through other clandestine activities, through sabotage, and that now Iran certainly won't have a nuclear weapon until at least 2015. Now, what that does is it sets everything back a few years, and this, obviously we've seen this for the past 30 years. Now, in response to Dagan's prediction that by 2015, Iran could potentially have a nuclear weapon, if they really, really wanted to, meaning if they actually had a nuclear weapons program. In response to this, Hillary Clinton, the beloved Hillary Clinton, made clear while she was on tour, a whirlwind Mideast tour with all our dictator friends, and she was speaking in Abu Dhabi, and and she said, well, this new prediction, 2015, this is a quote from Clinton. She said, "We don't want anyone to be misled by anyone's intelligence analysis." So we should all take note of that. Maybe the only true thing she's ever said. Now, yeah, it's unbelievable. Now, meanwhile, around the same time, Iran invited numerous representatives from many different countries, some of them with close relations to Iran, some not so much, to tour some of the nuclear facilities around Iran. This was dismissed by many in the West as being a ploy to distract from the nuclear program negotiations that are going to be coming up very, very shortly, to try and divide the major world powers against each other, that some went to Iran, some weren't invited, a very kind of adolescent ploy. And some countries accepted. Some countries are going to be going and touring Iranian nuclear facilities this coming weekend. Some declined. One of the invites that was declined was the invite to the European Union. And in response to the invitation, the EU Foreign Affairs Chief, Catherine Ashton, declined the invite, said, "No thanks, we don't want to go tour Iran. And she said, it's not our job, it's not the EU's job to look at sites and establish, what they are, because that, as she says, requires expertise. And Ashton said, the role of the inspectors of nuclear sites is for the IAEA. Meanwhile, just this past year, the EU imposed much harsher sanctions upon Iran than any year before. And she says that she and the EU is really kind of allowing the IAEA to tell everyone what the truth about Iran is, and that's not for her to decide. It's not for the EU or for any other country to decide. It's for the IAEA to decide. Now, what the IAEA has found is that Iran has no nuclear weapons program, is that Iran is consistently in line with their safeguards agreements, and that all declared nuclear material is under constant monitoring. Now, just a few days ago, and I'll end with this, three days ago, the current IAEA Director General, Yukiya Amano, was interviewed in Der Spiegel, the German newspaper. And the interviewer said to him, according to the most recent estimates, Iran is only 1 year away from building a bomb. Amano responded, I'm not so sure about that. Despite all unanswered questions, we cannot say that Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapons program. He also said that all enrichment facilities are, quote, completely subject to our monitoring. So, when we look at all of this and we take it all together, what we find is that there's a lot of things being said about the Iranian nuclear program. Almost all of them are untrue. And we need to really look at why these things keep being said, why we need a constant threat looming over our heads and looming over Israel. Why is it that Iran is always just around the corner from having a nuke? And why is that never actually reality and just keeps getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back? And I'll just end with this. In 1770, John Adams said, "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." Thank you.
Nima, that was, I didn't realize that those lies started so long ago, back in the 80s. It's good that we have young people who love history and they like to go back and look and see what the record says. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I wanted to say some names. Majid Shariati, doctor. Feridun Abbasi, doctor. These are two nuclear scientists that were just recently assassinated inside Iran. And I found an article in The Guardian. It's hard to find them in the US press, but they do occasionally show up. The title was "Covert War Against Iran's Nuclear Aims Takes a Chilling Turn, Using Cyberworms, Motorcycle Assassins, Who is behind the increasingly sinister campaign against the Iranian energy program?" And obviously, Nima pointed out that a lot of that media and a lot of the research shows that Israel has played a very, very negative role. And recently, I don't know if all of you know this because you may not read the Iranian press, but the English section of the Iranian press said that the intelligences of Iran have found and arrested at least two, I think it was more, Ardashir, how many was it? 8 people, 4 people, that were directly involved in these recent assassinations. So again, we ask who is threatening whom. Okay, our next speaker has a long history of combating some of these very negative policies that Nima mentioned, the hypocrisy, and Brian Becker is this gentleman to my right, is the national coordinator of the Answer Coalition, which is an anti-racist, anti-war organization that works to prevent intervention and war, and also defends civil and human rights of working people here in the United States and elsewhere, Iran, Africa, Asia, wherever there's oppression and injustice, you will find Brian Becker is either marching or speaking. Brian is an experienced organizer. How many of you, raise your hand if you've gone on an anti-war demonstration in Washington, D.C., organized by Answer? Come on, don't be shy. Hey, Brian. Good job. Brian's been there too. So I'm very, very proud to introduce to you Mr. Brian Becker.
I too want to thank the Friendship Committee for organizing tonight's event. It's quite important that we deal with the issue of the seemingly endless enmity between every U.S. administration and the government of Iran, the potential for another war on top of the already and continuing war and occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, and of course the never-ending war that's carried out by the Israeli proxy state against the Palestinian peoples. That threat of war is looming, although it's quite difficult to imagine that the United States, bogged down and unable to win in Afghanistan, and while still occupying Iraq, did so under very arduous circumstances, has the capability of actually taking on Iran, even though there are war hawks who certainly would want to. The use of aerial bombings of Iran will not overthrow the Islamic government. It will not overthrow the government. It will not change fundamentally the relationship of forces inside of Iran. If anything, a bombing attack on Iran, while it can undoubtedly do great damage to infrastructure, would, if anything, cement popular support within Iran for the current government. So that too is an option that is unenviable, at least that's the dominant thinking within the imperialist establishment, within the Pentagon. So the US has used other tactics. They've resorted to intensifying economic sanctions, covert operations, as Ellie and others have mentioned. They're killing, murdering, assassinating scientists and military figures inside Iran. They're trying to slow Iran's development. Most importantly, they're hoping that if enough pressure is applied to the current government in Iran, there will be some sort of implosion within Iran, using sectors of the middle classes and upper classes in particular as the human material to carry out a counter-revolutionary overturn of the current government. That was the real reason that the United States supported the so-called Green Movement after the last election, because they saw what they had not fully expected, a new opportunity to overthrow the government of Iran with Iranian people, certain sectors within Iran, people who undoubtedly have many grievances and many valid grievances, but who earn the support of Washington and Wall Street and the Pentagon and the CIA, not because of their valid grievances, but because the US establishment could see within the Green Movement the possibility for the recapturing of Iran by Western imperialist forces. That's the option that is the preferred option for the United States, given the difficulty of the other military options. And they need a pretext to maintain sanctions. They need a pretext to maintain the pressure cooker. They need a pretext to maintain all of the covert links to the opposition and the dissidents within Iran. And the nuclear issue is the pretext, nothing more. I mean, even if Iran, I take the word of this previous speaker, never developed a nuclear weapon, but let's say they did. Let's say they developed 100. The United States has 5,000 nuclear warheads. If Iran were to use a nuclear warhead of any type, or even a large-scale conventional weapon, the Iranian government, all sectors within Iran, have full cognizance of the fact that they would be incinerated. It's not a viable military strategy. It doesn't make any sense. It's beyond rationality. It's a pretext. The nuclear weapon is a pretext to overthrow the government. So the question, I think, for us, for those of us who are progressive people, is why does the US government want to overthrow the government of Iran? What's the real reason? If we can't answer that question, we will be endlessly confused in terms of how we should understand the struggle within Iran between the different social and political strata, and how US imperialism views the struggle between different factions and social strata within Iran. And unfortunately, many in the liberal and progressive community, far from understanding the situation, have taken the position of imperialism because they are not identifying what the real issue is in Iran. According to the US media, the issue was there a fair election? Or the issue is that it's a theocratic government, or that women's rights have been circumscribed, or that there is thuggery on the part of some forces within the supporters of the Islamic government against secular forces. That's what is presented in the Western media as that which drives US policy. And it's our position, the position of the Answer Coalition, that while it's extremely important what the form of government is inside of any country, not just Iran, it's very important to see what the social alignment is between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. It's very important to understand what the levels of democratic process and democratic rights are. It's, of course, important to see the status of women and what women's social and political rights are. All of these are important items in any country that must be understood and discussed and debated and fought over and struggled about. But US imperialism does not have its policy determined in regard to Iran or any country based fundamentally on any of those issues. Saudi Arabia is a theocratic government that has eviscerated and denied all rights to women, but there's no campaign really in the US imperialist media on behalf of Saudi women. Why? Because the Saudis are playing a different role from the point of view of US geostrategic interests. The United States said Saddam Hussein was the worst demon in the Middle East or maybe anywhere ever, with the exception of, you know, the pantheon of hated figures from Hitler to Mussolini or whomever. But of course, the Iraqi government, whatever you think about its political and social policies, had a secular orientation. Until 1990, there was no forced veiling of women in Iraq. There was free education. There was all sorts of social rights that resembled a European social democracy in Iraq, and yet, nonetheless, Iraq was targeted. Again, in that instance, nuclear weapons were used as a pretext. So what then explains the fundamentals of U.S. policy, if it's not those issues, if it's not the form of government and the alignment of social and political forces necessarily within the targeted country? It is whether or not the United States, in these extremely significant geostrategic countries, has the ability to 100% entirely dominate all parts of the economic and social order of those countries, not because they care about human rights, women's rights, democratic rights, but because they want to dominate these targeted countries for their own geostrategic imperial interests. And we can know this not just in these grand scale, we can look at Iran itself, look at its history, look at what actually has happened in the last 60 years. The U.S. says we should hate the Iranian government because it's a theocratic, non-democratic government. Well, in 1950, Iran had a democratic government, a secular government, the government of Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh. This democratically elected government, nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, now known as BP, later known as British Petroleum. And when it dared to say that Iran's oil should be used to develop Iran, to help eliminate poverty in Iran, to help Iran emerge from the legacy of underdevelopment, what happened to the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh? It was demonized with the same colorful rhetoric that is reserved now for the Islamic government or was used against Saddam Hussein. It was entirely sanctioned, as is happening today. It was denied the ability to sell oil after it dared to nationalize BP, British Petroleum. And it created so much discontent within Iran that the upper middle classes were used as the human material for the overthrow of the democratically elected government and its replacement by the Shah in 1953. The least democratic, most monarchical, dictatorial, semi-fascist type regime that you could imagine. And under its leadership, the United States had a complete proxy puppet force for the next 26 years. You know, if you go back and look at those 26 years, you can see the U.S. was encouraging the Shah to build nuclear power plants. Understood that it was, even though Iran had a great deal of oil, that it was a necessary component for sustained economic development for the Iranian regime to have nuclear power plants. The U.S. was helping to construct 26 nuclear power plants throughout Iran during that time period. What changed? When the people rose up in a multi-class, multi-stratified revolution in 1979, a real revolution, the U.S. lost its oil, it lost its primary listening post against the Soviet Union. Remember what Jimmy Carter said when he stood next to the Shah, showing how foolish Jimmy Carter was? To say, you, Shah, are an island of stability in a sea of turmoil. Well, what the hell does that mean? Well, what was the sea of turmoil? All over the Arab world and the Middle East, the people were rising up, carrying out revolution, rising up against imperialist and colonial domination, and only the Shah remained as the true, outside of the Israeli proxy regime, as the real puppet force, the proxy, the client of Washington. And when the people of Iran rose up and got rid of the dictator, then suddenly they became demons again. And even though it was an Islamic republic, a theocratic government, the United States returned to the same position of enmity that they maintained during the period of Mossadegh. See, it didn't matter whether it was a form of government between 50 and 53 and a different government from 79 to today. What made a difference is these two governments said to the United States, this oil belongs to us. This land belongs to us. This water belongs to us. Our people are not yours. They are not pawns on someone else's geostrategic chessboard. We, in fact, will be self-determining people. Now, if it had been a communist revolution in 1979, it would have been in an even more fearsome attack by U.S. imperialism against the Iranian government. I personally would have been for that. I would have been for a socialist Iran. But the fact that there is an independent Iran, an Iran that says we and only we, the Iranian people, will control our destiny and our land and our labor and our resources, that's reason enough for U.S. imperialism to maintain a ceaseless war against the Iranian people. Knowing this, sisters and brothers, what do? We who are students or workers here in the United States, when a government that speaks in our name sends our young people to fight endlessly in wars all over the place, spends our tax dollars, $1 trillion a year for militarism, including nuclear weapons, what do we do when this government says we must carry out endless war, sanctions, and threats against Iran? We, the people of the United States, must say, no, not in our name. We will stand against you. We will build a movement against you. We will organize and mobilize. And that's what we in the Answer Coalition, we in World Can't Wait, we in the different progressive organizations intend to do. It doesn't mean we have to have an identity of views with the current Iranian government to know that we must stand with the Iranian people and say they and only they will determine their own destiny. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brian. You know that we love Iran. You know, Ardeshir and I, how we feel. So it's so good to hear a progressive voice understand what's at stake. And it is whether the Iranian people will be reduced to what the Iraqi people have been reduced to, and the Afghani people, and the Pakistani people, and now the Yemeni people, and the people in Sudan. And the list could go on and on, because 739 US military bases around the world are not doing what they taught me when I was a child, and I believed it, that we're bringing democracy to the world's people. I had to grow up and look at what was really happening and understand, well, that kind of means that those people are kind of stupid and they're kind of uncivilized. Because if we have to bring democracy to them, well, they must be less than we are. And that's the basis that the United States can carry out its crimes, because us in this room, we care. And I really thank you. You all came here tonight because you care to hear how we can move forward and build a movement that really means democracy, that really means justice, that really means peace. Not the peace where someone has to live under a tent because we bombed the hell out of their land. And while I'm mentioning that, thank you, I cannot let the evening go. And I don't know every single name, but I know Joe Friendly. I'm thanking all those medias who are here. They play such an important job, and I've seen them at meeting after meeting after meeting, and I don't want to go home tonight without personally recognizing and thanking Mr. Joe Friendly, Mr. Fred Nguyen, he works with WBII, he has a radio program, Ms. Charlene Deck, and where's my other guy? Oh, there he is. Mr. Don DeBar, he runs WBAIX.org, X meaning in exile, because he didn't go along with some of the unjust and racist practices at WBAI by a group, so he has a radio station. This gentleman over here, do you want to say who you are, sir? Oh, he's from Press TV. Oh, thank you. And Susan Terani came, and Derek, and you are, sir?
Eddie, Liberation News.
Ah, Liberation News. I like that word. Thank you. Derek, it was your first name again? Eddie from Liberation News. And we also have some other reporters who came earlier. There's a gentleman here who represents the Islamic Republic News Agency. you know, those people over there in Iran actually have Iranians living here and working here and covering our peace movement. Okay, I hope if I forgot anyone, I apologize, and you'll tell me so that I will remember to recognize you. It's a very great honor for me to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Ray McGovern. He's probably the most well-known speaker on the panel tonight. He's as I put in our leaflet, Ray McGovern is a former intelligence analyst who worked for over 27 years in 7 US administrations. But what I didn't know until I called him and he agreed to be on our panel is that he's a native New Yorker. And he graduated summa cum laude from Fordham University in 2003. Very upset about the direction that this country was going. Ray, along with other former CIA employees and I think other government officials who were concerned, they founded the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, or V.I.P.S. But the funniest and best thing that I think that Mr. McGovern did, I remember, in May of 2006 in Atlanta, McGovern publicly challenged Donald Rumsfeld on the issue of the weapons of mass destruction. And of course, I learned in talking to Ray that if you're someone that's with the government and been in the government and they think that you should continue always being supporting the government, right or wrong, once he did that for 4 years, he was not contacted by any major media. No one would allow Ray McGovern to speak. And yet he didn't stop speaking the truth. And I just very quickly, I hope you won't mind, Ray, can I read the funny little thing you had with Mr. McGovern attended a speech by Defense Secretary. The whole press was there. This is what Ray said. "Why did you lie to get us into war, which was not necessary and has caused these kinds of casualties? You said you knew where these weapons of mass destruction were." Rumsfeld: "I did not. I said I knew where the suspect sites were." McGovern, quote, and he's reading from Rumsfeld's quote, "You said you knew where they were, quote, near Tikrit, near Baghdad, and east, west, south, and north, somewhat." Rumsfeld starts to get very upset. And at the time, if you watch the video, security starts to move toward Ray McGovern. We don't want this man saying these things. So Rumsfeld goes on, and he says, Ray says, "Your allegation that there was bulletproof evidence of ties between Al-Qaeda and Iraq," just like the evidence that Iran is building a nuclear weapon, right? And then Rumsfeld tries to say, no, he was, Zarqawi was in Baghdad during the pre-war period. That's a fact. Mr. McGovern says, "Zarqawi, he was in the north of Iraq in a place where Saddam had no rule. That's where he was." "Well, he was also in Baghdad." And then McGovern answers, "Yes, when he needed to go to the hospital." Then he turned to the press and he said, "Come on, these people," meaning the surrounding press, "aren't idiots." Well, we still have a problem with some of those people because they may not be idiots, but they aren't doing their job well. And with that, I just want to introduce Mr. Ray McGovern. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. What an encouraging thing. For those of you who, like so many of the others of us, have trouble preventing oneself from being down in the mouth, or thinking, "Oh God, this will never get any better," well, I'd ask you to take just 5 seconds out and look around you and see what stalwart companions you have here. We're not alone, and there are enough of us. Cesar Chavez, one of my favorite people, used to always say, you know, you can make speeches, you can write letters, and you can write op-eds, but without action, nothing's going to happen. People say we have to wait until there are enough of us. There are enough of us, folks, and we can't wait any longer. This is a wonderful event here. I welcome you all, including the Homeland Security folks I see in the back there, and the FBI folks over there, and the insinuator over here, and the prevaricator over there. You're all welcome. You might learn something. If you'd like to identify yourselves, we'd be grateful. You don't have to be anxious. Your bosses let us know that you're coming. No one is willing to. Okay. Well, the name of the game, folks, is, as Nima said so eloquently, Iran is a threat to U.S.-Israeli domination of that part of the world. Now, that's bad enough, but it happens to be the fact that that part of the world has got immense resources of the oil and gas that God made that terrible mistake in putting our oil under their sand, okay? Now, of course, that was the rationale, unstated, used in 1953, and we owe all Iranians a very deep apology for what happened in 1953. That was unconscionable, and everyone, the whole world, is paying the price for that right now. Now, it's not a very popular thing to say, and I thought maybe especially in New York City, that the whole name of the game is to reassert the U.S.-Israeli influence and protect it in the Persian Gulf area. And when I did say that at a congressional hearing run by John Conyers back, I think it was 2005, it was really interesting. The hearing was on weapons of mass destruction, and specifically the very revealing documents out of the British, out of Downing Street, they were called the Downing Street Memos, which showed that the whole thing was a farce, that the president had decided to make war on Iraq for regime change, okay? And that it was all laid on, and that the information and the intelligence would be fixed around the policy. You know, these are documents going back long before the war, okay? So what happened as a result of that is that after we got everyone, Joe Wilson, Cindy Sheehan, another person, and I got finished explaining what happened, and then one of the congressmen looked out and he said, well, will one of you, maybe one of the four, could you explain to me then why we did attack Iraq? It wasn't for weapons of mass destruction. It wasn't because of ties between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. What was it? So I looked around and nobody seemed to be terribly interested in answering the question. So I said pretty much what Nima said. You know, it's a strategic area, and the U.S. and Israel want to preserve their strategic dominance in that area. And all of a sudden, in the eyes of these very progressive Democratic representatives, they started, there was actually, you could see almost some fear in their eyes, you know. And so I figured, well, here I'm on live TV. When are you going to get another chance like this, McGovern? And I said, oh, I see that I've said something not very politically correct, but you know, you should realize that a lot of our policy is formed by the influence of the so-called neocons who have trouble distinguishing between what they see as the strategic interests of Israel on the one hand and the strategic interests of the United States of America on the other. And then there started to be some real fidgeting among these representatives. And I went on in that vein. I said, you know, you all refer to Israel as an ally. The American people should know that Israel is not an ally. To be an ally, you need to have a mutual defense treaty. There is no such mutual defense treaty between the United States and Israel, and there's a good reason for that. We broached this to them back when they started having wars with the Arabs. We said, hey, maybe a mutual defense treaty would deter the Arabs from attacking you. Would you feel a lot better than that? And they said, thanks very much, but no thanks. Why? Well, because mutual defense agreements require internationally recognized boundaries. The Israelis didn't want to put up to any discussion the occupied territories. Not only that, but things are working pretty well for them now. You know, some people would say that had suggested that Israel become the 51st state of the United States, but the Israelis turned that down flat. Do you know why? No, because then they'd only have 2 senators. But kidding aside, you know, I said, you have to realize that there are 2 different countries here and that we can't be bound to follow the Israelis' example. And wow, when I said that, you know, intelligence analysts are not very attuned to political realities. I know that this was not usually heard, but I just tell them what you know, I'm not running for office and I don't need any more money. And so I was free to say what the situation was. Well, David Milbank for the Washington Post trotted right behind me as I went over to NPR. And he said, why are you so anti-Semitic? I said, anti-Semitic? Give me a break, give me a data. He says, well, you said those anti-Semitic things. I said, no, those are factual things. Next thing I know, Dana writes this vitriolic sort of thing in the Washington Post for the next day about McGovern being anti-Semitic. But more important was what happened next, and that was that within 2 hours, those New York representatives issued a joint statement saying that what I had said was anti-Semitic and that it was beyond the pale. And if they were in the room at the time, they certainly would have objected. Of course, they were in the room at the time. They didn't say peep. They were too shocked to hear this, okay? And then Howard Dean issued a statement, the head of the Democratic Party. McGovern's anti-Semitic. We disavow anything he said, blah, 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 okay? Within 3 hours.
Wow.
Now, I learned later, 2 days later, from a friend of mine who's high in the Dallas Democratic Party, that she had Howard Dean out there in Dallas for a fundraiser 2 days later. And she said, Howard, what about those Downing Street minutes, that Conyers conference, wasn't it? I said, that was awful. And she said, awful? That shows that the administration was lying all along on Iraq. No, I don't mean that. I mean that guy that anti-Semitic guy. So she says, you mean Ray McGovern? Yeah, that was his name. She said, well, he's a good friend of mine. Well, he may be a good friend of yours, but look, I had to come back into the office that evening. All kinds of people were calling. I mean, not small fry like these Dallas fun people. These are big guys, okay? They were calling me and saying, look, you got to issue a statement right away. Disavow this. So I did. Now that's how it works, folks. That's how it works. And the supreme irony here is that I know Howard Dean. I watched him try to learn how to play golf in his Madras Bermuda shorts at the poshest of country clubs out in eastern Long Island called the Maidstone Club on the dunes over the ocean in East Hampton, Long Island. And there are a couple other caddies here. Would the other caddies please identify themselves? All right, okay, right? Now, I used to caddy for Howard Dean's dad and his mother as I watched this teenager grow up. And it was a very exclusive club. It reminded me, as I read the cable about the king of the premier of Tunisia and how he lived in this regal opulence. I was reminded of the Maidstone Club and actually of the advice that my grandmother gave me, my Irish grandmother, before I went off for my first job at the age of 14. It's when you could get a social security number, then you could work at a golf course. She said, Raymond, before you go out there, you need to know the definition of the upper crust. Now you have to realize my grandmother worked as a seamstress with the upper crust as an Irish immigrant. And I said, oh, Grandma, I know that. She said, no, you don't know. Now sit down and listen. She said, the upper crust is a bunch of crumbs held together by a lot of dough. Well, that was the Maidstone Club, but the point of my remarks about this was that it was a very exclusive club. Now, you New Yorkers know what exclusive means. My friends down in Washington don't know much about this. What does exclusive mean? Anyone? No Jews. So here's Howard Dean. unable to take his current wife to have dinner at the Maidstone Club, calling me anti-Semitic, okay? I mean, talk about chutzpah. Now, there's a point to all these remarks. Wow, I'm already, holy Moses. I didn't mean to go off on this tangent. I do want to talk about why. Talking about this early on, I talked about neocons. And one of the extreme right people writing on a blog said, McGovern, he's that anti-Semite. He's saying neocons was just a code word for Jew. He knows that. And I didn't know that. Can you believe that? You know, I know a little bit about foreign affairs, but I didn't know much about, neocons and the thing. So I looked up the names of all these people who were responsible for the Iraq War, and as I opened them up, I thought, what some analyst you are, McGovern, 8 out of 10 are Jewish people. Okay, maybe there's a connection there, Is it not possible to say that? I mean, when John Kennedy came down to this capital, some of you are old enough to remember about the Irish Mafia. John O'Donnell, all the Irishmen that he put into that was a joke, the Irish Mafia. Could anybody talk these days about the Jewish Mafia? Well, there was a big, big influence by the Likud lobby. And let me just say a word about that. Mearsheimer and Walt addressed this. Actually, they were hired by The Atlantic to address this question. Not so much the Israel lobby, but the general issue in Iraq. And when they gave The Atlantic the draft, The Atlantic immediately said, well, maybe you ought to take it somewhere else. They couldn't get it published in the United States. They had to get it published by the London Review of Books. I just want to tick off a couple of quick things that show the inordinate influence of the Likud lobby. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, brain trust, or the sponsor behind 9/11, so to speak, okay? Why did he do it? Anybody know why he said he did it? Don't you read the New York Times? It wouldn't help you. He was captured as those young people were drafting the 9/11 Commission report, and I could just see the discussion. Hey, see in the Post this morning? They got Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Let's find out what he says, why he did it. That was the whole point of the exercise, I suppose, a lot of it. And so they got the CIA to ask their people, the interrogators, ask them, what did he say? Anybody know? Well, I refer you to page 147 of the 9/11 Commission report, which is phrased in a sort of strange way because Khalid Sheikh Mohammed has a degree in mechanical engineering from the University of North Carolina in Greensboro. I don't know if any of you knew that. So these young people immediately jumped to the conclusion, he must have had an affair of the heart in Greensboro. Or maybe he got thrown in jail there for something. He's got an animus against the United States for these reasons. Well, no. This is what the report said. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's animus against the United States was not due to anything he experienced in the United States when he was studying there, but as he put it, it was due to his extreme hatred for U.S. policy favoring Israel, end quote. Why is it that none of you have read that in the New York Times? I mean, this is the guy that was going to be tried here, right? Why do you suppose a lot of people didn't want him tried here in New York? Maybe he was going to say what he told the interrogators on page 147, and maybe that would be viewed as beyond the pale, incorrect. I don't want to take too much more time, but I do want to maybe just say a couple of words about a couple other things. How many know about the USS Liberty? Okay, those of you who don't, go onto their website, ussliberty.org, I think it is. I guess the last thing I'll point out here is the number of the question, it seems to me. Why is it that none of you had heard about what Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had said? Why is it that American people don't know what's going on. Well, I've been down in Washington for 48 years, and I've seen a lot of change. But there's one change that I describe as a sea change that dwarfs all the other changes put together. And that, my friends, is the fact that we no longer have a free media. No longer have in any real sense a free media, and that is big. That leaves us all malnourished on information. It leaves the people in the pro-Zionist New York Times ample opportunity to frame our views so that Iran becomes a terrible threat, where Iran is working on a nuclear weapon. When the intelligence community says, and I quote, "We assess with great confidence that Iran stopped building a nuclear weapon in the fall of 2003 and have not resumed work on that." That is still valid, folks, but you wouldn't find that in the New York Times. What do you find in the New York Times? Well, I'll end with this because I think it's really illustrative. Wiki-leaks. That's the good news, folks. The fourth estate is dead. But there's a fifth estate. And the fifth estate is where? In the ether, right? On the web. And it's not susceptible to government or corporation or advertisers, not susceptible to control by anybody, not yet anyway. And so that gives me great hope because we can learn things that we never knew before. There are all kinds of things we've learned. Don't be deceived by those who say there's nothing new in these things. Now, what I'd like to just bring out here is that on the day after, or the day when it was permitted, New York Times, Spiegel, and The Guardian to publish on these documents released by WikiLeaks, the New York Times had, I've read, 3 to 4 weeks to pore over this material and decide how to treat it. Okay, now how did they treat it? How many of you remember the page 1 of the New York Times? Here it is, folks. The dark shadow, well, that's Syrian Bashar al-Assad. He's reported to be arming Hezbollah with Scud missiles. Scud missiles. Give me a break. The rest is all about our favorite topic, Iran. Here, the prominent excerpt here, the path to long-range missile development in Iran. The U.S. has said the main potential avenue for Iran developing long-range missiles is by using current systems as building blocks. Another path might be the so-called BM-25 missile that the U.S. believes was sold to Iran by North Korea. The story talks about this missile. 17 of them are in place already in Iran, and they can reach all manner of places in Europe and elsewhere. So obviously we need a missile shield. And here's a photo of this in color. It was a red-tipped missile being shown on a parade ground, the sort of like red square of Pyongyang. Okay, and guess what? The rest of the cable says it's what we in the Bronx used to call a crock. Down in Washington, we call it what large animals leave behind in pasture. There is no such missile. That's a mock-up. And the rest of the cable said, the Russians laughed at this and said, we know about this missile. It comes from one of our early naval missiles. That's not a missile. And if they wanted to make something out of that, it'll take them 3 years to get a missile. Now, New York Times forgot to print a retraction for that, but to its credit, the Post did put it on page 1. What else we have here? Well, let's see. Oh, I really need that. Ahmadinejad and the disputed election. Now, why is the adjective disputed always in front of that election, which, and why is the well, why is the 2000 election, which was really disputed and which was given to the person who didn't get the votes in Florida, why is that no longer a disputed election, you know? Are there double standards here? The Times provided the details on how Bush lost in Florida, but it was on the 19th paragraph in the story that finished that thing up. Okay, well, this is what I want to show you. Now, if you can't tell that Iran is building a nuclear weapon from this picture of Ahmadinejad and his unsmiling generals and the whole army behind him, well, then you're not much of an analyst, okay? Half page, okay? What else? Well, I don't want to keep you forever, but I could go on forever. Here's what's this? Ah, yeah, these are the Iranian. These are the Arabs. They hate Iran. They hate Iran as much as the Iragusa Indians hated Gene Autry. They hate him from another picture. Private joke. Okay, so whoops, I got them upside down. Now, here you go. All right. Well, these are all the kings and stuff. And I was asked at one interview, well, what about these kings? They all fear Iran. It says here right in the New York Times, fears of nuclear Iran. King so-and-so. And it was right before Christmas. I couldn't resist. We three kings of Orient are trying to prove that Iran is a threat. You know, it's bull. It's bull. And it goes on forever. Now, what about all these kings that want us to zap or to step on the serpent or whatever? What was it? Cut off the head of the serpent. What about these? Who do they represent? Who do they represent? Nobody. Except the upper crust, okay? And that's shown today by what happened in Tunisia. Yes. And you can read a WikiLeaks cable which incredibly foretells this, not explicitly, but just by depicting the opulence, the extravagance in which these rulers of Tunisia were living. Well, the last thing I'll say is this. The Brookings Institute, which also runs the Sabin Center, which is a Zionist paid for and Zionist influence institute, it conducted a survey a few months ago, and its polls show what the Arabs really think about Iran. The results are rather striking. They show Arab opinion holds that the major threat to the region is Israel, followed very closely by our own beloved United States of America. By a factor of 7 to 8 to 1, they fear America and Israel more than they fear Iran. Now these are the people, okay? These are the real people. These aren't the sheikhs and the three kings of Orient are. So, as my grandmother would say at this point, if that society would excuse me. Thank you very much.